Joining us now is our very good friend, Ambassador Patrick Theros, and I love having Patrick Theros on our show because he's so knowledgeable. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Qatar, 1995 to 1998 in the Bill Clinton administration, and he's a 36-year career in the United States Foreign Service, and he joined the Foreign Service in 1963. I was only 5 years old when he joined the service, so now I don't feel as old as I normally do when he comes on. And he's now president of the U.S. Qatar Business Council, and he is joining us now, Ambassador Patrick Theros. Sir, I love having you on. Thanks for being with us.
John, it's always a pleasure. I have a lot of fun on these interviews. It's always a pleasure to join you.
Okay, we got a lot to talk about today, and your knowledge, I absorb it like a sponge. We're going to get to a lot of stuff today, so we got to go rapid fire. But let's start with one thing that the New York Times seem to have forgotten about as they run phony op-eds on people that I don't think even exist. Such another topic, though. The Yemeni crisis, 50,000 people now, Yemenis dead in this war or whatever it is. And the Saudi Emirates Axis coalition, if you will, getting the backing of the United States and the United Kingdom, the school bus that blew up, the market that blew up, kids dying. There's U.S. armaments are involved. We're advising the Saudi pilots. What's the deal here? What's the end game?
The deal here is that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, going back to basic causes, is trying to reform the country. His country, when you try to reform a country, you're going to break a lot of rice bowls, going to make a lot of enemies. So what's the best way possible to get ahead with what you're doing is create an international diversion. And in this case, the Saudis had a variety of real and imagined complaints about Yemen, so they intervened in the civil war. Well, clearly this proved to be a huge mistake. They intervened on the argument, very specious argument, that Iran was going to take over Yemen if they didn't intervene. That no one has ever taken over Yemen, so that was a bit of a joke. But the problem is that once they got in there, they ran into the same phenomenon that a lot of countries have done. It happened to us in Vietnam. Richard Nixon came to power saying, I'm going to get out of Vietnam, and people went to him and said, you can't be the one who lost Vietnam. Well, it's the same thing with Mohammed bin Salman. Having gotten involved in Yemen, it is a mistake. It is costing them. It's not costing the Iranians almost anything. I mean, somebody once, I've seen estimates that for every dollar the Saudis spend in Yemen, the Iranians are spending 1 cent. The problem is that if he pulls out now and admits that it wasn't such a good idea, it undermines his authority in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, and there are a heck of a lot of people in Saudi Arabia that are looking for any excuse to undermine him. So he's trapped. What the UAE is up to is a little bit more complicated. I think the UAE is apparently, is trying to actually break off the southern part of Yemen, which has which has oil and gas, as well as one of the most important ports in the Indian Ocean,
right?
And basically turn that into an independent, but a satellite of the UAE, so that they extend their influence in that direction. So that even though the Saudis and the Yemen and the UAE are theoretically on the same side, they really have conflicting interests. The idea, as I said, the idea that this was an Iranian takeover of Yemen is a joke that I think is understood by virtually everybody. Obama made the mistake of giving them the green light because he needed them to sign on to the Iran nuclear deal. The thing I don't understand about this administration is, for better or for worse, they've canned the Iran nuclear deal. So why exactly is it that we still need to support the Saudis? I would like to see an interesting, an explanation on that, because like I said, Obama supported the Saudis in Yemen to get their agreement to the Iran nuclear deal. Trump kills the nuclear deal. Why are we still in there? It makes no sense whatsoever, other than perhaps the fear that it will, in fact, undermine Mohammed bin Salman, and then we will have an internal problem in Saudi Arabia. If that's the case, then I don't... Hello?
Go ahead, Ambassador. You
Yeah.
still there?
Yeah.
So, Ambassador Theros, I've asked this question to a number of both Republican and Democratic federal elected officials, Congress and U.S. Senate, and nobody's given me an answer. You just gave me the best answer, which is, maybe the Trump administration is there because they're afraid the whole Saudi domestic situation unravels, and they're not prepared to go down that path right now. But other than that, it just doesn't make any sense why we're involved in this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nothing else. In the past there might have been other arguments, the Iran nuclear deal and stuff like that.
Exactly.
But this makes no sense whatsoever unless we think that it will undermine the regime in Saudi Arabia. And the regime in Saudi Arabia could use undermining, except the fact of the matter is, if it is, the chaos that would follow would make everything else that's happened in the Middle East look like a bunch of little old ladies having tea.
Well, I tell you what, I know the president is asking the question why we're there. We don't know what the answer is that he's getting from Mike Pompeo and Secretary Mattis and others, but that's the question to ask. Why are we involved in this? And hopefully we'll get this worked out. Paraguay, this shocked me. I guess I didn't see this coming. I know I heard rumors about it, but so Paraguay, in order to gain favor with the Trump administration, moves their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, along with just after the U.S. did. And under pressure, now they pull out. And of course, the fact that they're going back to Tel Aviv has been met with glee from the Arab League. But I'm shocked that you would move an embassy and then move it back. What was their reason here?
I suspect that somebody in Washington convinced them that if they did so, there would be some big reward coming out of Washington. But it appears that no one in Washington noticed. Paraguay, there may have been, somebody, like I said, there's always some lobbyist earning a lot of money for no good reason at all, who probably went to him and said, look, you do this and I can get you something, whatever it is they want, foreign aid, military aid, a meeting with the president, with President Trump, whatever. And I'm sure the lobby, they announced they were moving the embassy without having checked this thing out in advance, and then realized that there was no reward. And on the other hand, first of all, there's a large Palestinian and Lebanese immigrant population in Paraguay, particularly in the area in the southern part of the country. And secondly, I think there's a lot of money that comes into Paraguay from people wanting to put money there. And the only people putting money there these days might be some of the Arabs. Mm-hmm. So the combination is, why did we make such a decision on the off chance we might get something for the Americans? In the meantime, it's costing us significantly inside the country. So I also suspect that the president of Paraguay didn't consult with his cabinet or with the politicians in Paraguay when he made the decision. So I think all this has to do with Paraguay's relationship with the U.S., which they're unimportant to us, and we tend to treat unimportant countries with a certain amount of disdain, unfortunately. And secondly, domestic Paraguayan politics. I think it has absolutely nothing to do with anything going on in the Middle East.
Man, I think you have nailed that. As always, former ambassador to Qatar, Patrick Theros, with us. He was the ambassador there 95 to 98 in the Bill Clinton administration. And obviously you can see that the ambassador's knowledge of the area is unparalleled for anybody that we talk to. Now, I'm going to get to the Gulf. Let's get back to the Gulf, Mr. Ambassador. Update us on the Gulf geopolitical situation now. The blockade going into its 18th month, and it's been a disaster for the blockading countries. Now they're going to build a moat or something. What are they? Some kind of a canal or a moat?
I know everybody's sort of scratching their heads. This border area is about 100 miles of howling wilderness. There's nothing there. It is open desert. There might be a little bit of scrub here and there. The West Texas, it looks a little bit drier than and more desolate than West Texas. Is probably the best way of describing it. I have absolutely no idea what they have in mind. The Qataris are going back and forth that I talk to between this is a joke and laughing at it to, okay, they want to do it. It's not bad. It'll probably keep some construction companies going. And in a small way, they're already isolated, so why not just make the isolation into a real one down in that part of the border? Nothing's crossing. Part of the border is already water. I mean, there's a something that looks like a fjord, except it's not Norway. It's there. It's something that looks like a fjord that comes in from the eastern part of the country. So that's maybe a third of the border. That's already water. To make this real, you have to make it at least a couple 300 feet wide, and then you're going to have to spend millions of dollars dredging it all the time because you got drifting sand coming in from the west on a constant basis. So I have no idea why they would want to spend that amount of money to accomplish nothing other than the symbolism of making Qatar into an island. And I'll tell you, the minute you stop maintaining it, this thing's going to silt up and go away. So it's actually difficult to describe it in anything other than a big joke.
It is a joke, and it seems like it's done more for PR reasons than geographical reality to get anything out of it. So they haven't actually started it yet. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
So
if you want to isolate the place, the easiest way to do it would be to get a couple thousand bulldozers and just build up a big sand wall on the Saudi side of the border. That would be just as effective. And at about a quarter of the cost, and you don't have to maintain it.
Well, we'll see what plays out. So what's the end game here with this blockade in the Gulf?
No one's figured that one out yet. I think one of the reasons we've just delayed, we'd called a summit, a meeting here for the 6 GCC countries plus Egypt and Jordan and the U.S. To try and resolve this and bring about an end game. It was called for the end of October, about mid-October, and now we're told it's been pushed off into some undetermined date in 2019. Honestly, I think that the people who know anything about this in state and defense and the intelligence services went to the White House and said, you're either risking an embarrassing blow-up or an embarrassing... you're risking embarrassment by getting all these countries together and then having nothing to show for it. You don't want to have meetings in which you haven't really choreographed the end of it, or you know exactly what you want to do. I mean, the United States... it's 40 years now since Jimmy Carter had the Camp David meeting between Begin and Sadat that ended up with the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Carter's people, Brzezinski and the others, had an end game. They knew what the U.S. wanted at the end of this, and they had a realistic one. They realized that they could probably get an Egyptian-Israeli peace, but they couldn't get a linkage between that and the Palestinian-Israeli agreement. But they knew what they wanted. They called the meeting, and when the participants weren't able to work on them, Carter came down on them like a ton of bricks, and they did. Well, if we don't know what the end game is, I wouldn't call a meeting. And I suspect that no one in Washington knows what end game we are prepared to play for. And I mean, it's got to be an end game that's to our advantage. An end game where we come down on one side or the other in this particular dispute will come out ugly. So if you look at all the possibilities from the U.S., purely U.S. point of view, continuation of the status quo is probably better than coming down on one side or the other.
So no end game, no side to come down. Yet let's get back to the Carter summit with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, right? So the end game was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel,
right?
But that meant that the Carter administration had to come down on one side, right?
Yeah, they did. But the benefits to us from having it were worth the risk of coming down on one side. And also, the truth of the matter is that was also a benefit to Israel. So even though, Begin knew it was on to Israel's advantage, what Begin feared was he had ideological people in his own political party that didn't want to give up any settlements and territory that they had occupied. So Begin was caught between his own politicians and the greater good of Israel, and like most politicians, he was going to favor the politicians rather than the greater good. And Carter gave him a deal he couldn't turn down. You can go down in history as the guy who achieved the first peace treaty between Israel and a major Arab country, or you can go down as a guy who scuttled it for local political reasons. And that was essentially what happened. Here, I think that, first of all, there's a lot of conflicting advice inside the country as to what we should do if we come down hard on the Qataris. There is a lot to be lost. Cooperation on defense, which with Qatar has been better than with any of the other countries. Perhaps American companies will get cut out of the gas fields. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong for the United States if we pressure the Qataris. If we pressure the Saudis and the UAE, there's a whole series of things that can go wrong that, again, we can't control. So I think the president's his advisors probably have got this whole series of position papers saying, if you do this, it's bad. If you do that, it's bad. If you do nothing, it's bad, but it ain't quite as bad as the other two.
Basically, the Trump administration here with the Gulf crisis is in they're in a box, and they're in a lose-lose situation. You come down to solve it, you have to take a side, and the risks of taking either side way outweigh the negative of just letting the thing sustain.
Exactly.
Because there's an argument to say that the Qataris have invested a lot of money in the United States. Plus, we have our biggest base in the region there by far, and they fund that. And there's a great relationship, and all that's going on. But then, the president doesn't want to disrupt also, his relationship with MBS and the Saudis. So they're in a lose-lose. As you're saying, It's better off just keep it. And the reality of it, other than the humanitarian crisis, the Qataris have basically figured this blockade out.
That's
so
correct.
It's not like, people are starving and there's, settlements going on and all that. So it's just...
Yeah, the other thing is they're even working their way around the humanitarian thing. For example, non-Qataris married to Qataris can now apply for Qatari citizenship, which means that there is a way of, let's say a Qatari woman who was married to a UAE husband. If the husband wants to take the risk, he can leave the UAE, go to a third country, and go to Qatar, and then get Qatari citizenship. There's a little bit of a procedure involved, but it's one way of reuniting families.
So you can get around that. Now, what about Qatar's new exit visa and permanent residency rules? Is that something
that
separate?
Is revolutionary for the region.
Now, what is that?
Is,
I just saw that the other day.
One of the most revolutionary things they've done. They've done away completely with what is known as the kafala system, that you needed your employer's permission to leave the country. Right now, let me tell you, this was somewhat painful for them, because under the rules, the employer is responsible for the debts and so forth of the person he's sponsored to bring into the country. So they had to do a lot of legislation to lift the burden from the employers before they could get to allowing people to leave without an exit visa. Now, if the employer has some grudge against his employee or some problem with his employee, he's got to go to court and get some sort of order first. It's got to be a regular order. It can't be. It's no longer is he can just hold him up because he doesn't like the cut of his hair, which is the way it was in the past. So Yemen hasn't. I'm sorry, Yemen. The UAE has not done this. Bahrain has not done this. Saudi Arabia has not done this. In Saudi Arabia, it's particularly difficult. But so what they have done is they've made working in Qatar a lot more attractive, and also it takes away a lot of the arguments being used against them by other people who say are trying to take the World Cup away from them.
So walk us through a real-life example. Let's say my 28-year-old son, there's an opportunity to work for FIFA doing something, and he wants to go to Doha, and he wants to work for a Qatari company. What happens? Just walk us through what the new rule means.
The first thing that happens is that before he goes there, he has to have a work offer with a contract attached to it. The contract says your sons are going to get paid, $10,000 a month in housing. That is, that contract has to be registered with the Qatari Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor then informs the Foreign Ministry, which can issue the work visa to your son. I mean, your son, for non-work visa, you can just go there at the airport. But for a work visa, so he's issued the work visa. He goes there. He starts working for the country. The other thing the employer is required to do is open a bank account for your son in a Qatari bank. And the central bank monitors that bank account. They're spending a lot of money on computers, so that if your son is going to get $10,000 a month, sometime between the 1st and the 5th of the month, that bank account's got to show a $10,000 deposit from the registered employer. If it's not there, Qatar government will go and take the money from the registered employer and put it there and fine the registered employer. This is to make sure that people are paid, that no one's being cheated on their salaries, which used to happen a lot, unfortunately, in the past. Mm-hmm. And then your son wants to go take a vacation, come back to the States, live it up a little bit. He's just normal. He's got his passport. He's got the entry stamp, which includes the visa that he can work there. And he just goes down, buys his ticket, goes down to the airport, gets on an airplane, and goes away. I mean, you're registered on the way out. They note that you're leaving, but there's no restriction on leaving if presumably you haven't gotten in trouble with the law.
What a simple system, right? It makes too much sense. But I got to tell you, it's just another, Ambassador, it's just another kind of liberalization policy that the state of Qatar has done in order to move forward in the 21st century. And, there's a lot of thinking that the Saudis and Bahrain and the UAE, they're petrified of the freedoms that the Qatari government continues to give their people because, once you let freedom out of a bottle, right, you can't put it back in. And that might run over to their countries. And
I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the Saudi demands of the Qataris when this thing first began was we want Qatar to behave like the other countries in the Gulf. They didn't phrase it that way, but that was essentially the demand.
Mm-hmm. And one of their other demands was closing down Al Jazeera, which is like the only pure news network left on the face of the earth, as far as I'm concerned. They really do a super job.
They really are pretty good. I'll tell you, when Al Jazeera America shut down, I got sort of disappointed because at that point, I watched I don't like reading my news on a TV screen. I mean, on a computer screen. My eyesight just isn't good enough. And I like watching it on television. Let me tell you, there's very little you can watch on television right now that's informative.
I know. That was it. And I was
pick a side.
Pick a side.
I tend to be rather pragmatic, and I try to watch everybody. And after a while, I get a headache and go get a drink.
I don't blame you. And I was one of the only people in media that I watched Al Jazeera America when they had it on cable religiously. I mean, because I got news. And they had some of the best reporters, and I would get them on my show from around the world. And they were very informative, and it was really great stuff. And I was very saddened when they pulled the plug on it. Mr. Ambassador, always a fascinating conversation with you. I always learn.
It is mine
so
as well,
much.
sir.
Thank you for sharing with our audience and with all of our listeners your vast knowledge and the comparison you made, the analogy between Carter Summit at Camp David and the problems with having a similar one with the Gulf crisis. That was just fantastic, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
More than welcome, sir.